The dress uniform was the worst part. Commander Sarah Voss had worn body armor into 4 war zones, had slept in her boots on the cold floor of a medical ship, while her crew died 2 rooms over, had once worn the same clothes for 11 days during the siege of Callisto Station. None of that had been comfortable, but none of it had made her feel as trapped as the dark blue ceremonial jacket they'd put her in for the signing. It had gold buttons. She hated the buttons. She stood in the receiving line aboard the Concorde flagship, Eternal Resolve. And she kept her face completely still, and she hated every single button. Around her, the ceremony was enormous. There was no other word for it. The Concorde had built the receiving hall to impress, and it impressed. 300 feet of polished obsidian floor, ceilings that curved upward into false sky, holographic banners carrying the sigil of all 14 Concorde species, rotating slowly in the recycled air. The light was warm and deliberate. Someone had thought very hard about this room. Someone had wanted humans to walk in and feel small. Sarah thought they'd succeeded, which annoyed her. The human delegation stood on one side of the long treaty table. 20 people in uniforms that cost more than some colony ships. Ambassadors, generals, 1 senator who kept adjusting his collar. Behind them, 100 more. Aides, security staff, journalists from Earth's major networks, people who'd spent their careers dreaming of this moment. First contact plus 40 years. First treaty. The day humanity stopped being a footnote in galactic history and became something with a seat at the table. On the other side, Admiral Gren of the Concorde High Command, and behind him, his people. Gren was Vithali, tall, pale-skinned, with 4 eyes arranged in a wide, flat band across his face. His species had been running the Concorde's military for 200 years. He wore white. He wore it the way certain people wear white, like it was a statement, like dirt would not dare touch him. He smiled at Sarah when she entered the hall. She did not smile back. That was the first thing she noticed, not the smile itself. Gren had been smiling throughout every diplomatic meeting for the past 8 months. He smiled the way a man smiles when he knows the end of a story you're still reading. She'd cataloged it, filed it, moved on, but this smile was different. This one was looser, easier, the smile of a man who was almost done waiting. She looked away from him and studied the room. The honor guard was wrong. Concorde protocol for treaty ceremonies called for an honor guard positioned at the main entrance. Ceremonial, symbolic, a statement of welcome. Sarah had read every piece of diplomatic documentation she could find on Concorde formal procedures. She'd read them the way a person reads a map of a building they might need to run through. The honor guard belonged at the entrance. These guards were at the exits. She counted 8 exit points. She counted 40 guards. She counted the angle of their weapons, carried loose, one-handed, the way you carry something you might need to raise quickly. Her face stayed still. She thought, how long have those guards been here? She moved to her position at the treaty table, and she looked at the room again, slowly, the way she'd learned to look at rooms, not for what was there but for the shape of what was missing. Eternal Resolve was a flagship, the biggest ship in the Concorde fleet. Flagships had crews in the thousands. This ceremony had invited, officially, 140 human personnel and approximately the same number of Concorde observers. The rest of the ship was very quiet. Not empty quiet, alert quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a large number of people are doing something very carefully and trying not to make sound while they do it. The senator gave his speech. Sarah listened for tone, not content. He was doing the thing politicians do at moments like this, reaching for historic significance, borrowing weight from the occasion itself, talking about the future in the present tense. He was good at it. He believed it. She watched his hands, not his face, because people's hands don't perform. His hands were loose, happy. He thought this was real. Ambassador Deary signed first, the senior Concorde diplomat, a small gray-furred creature from a species called the Mean, who had been humanity's primary contact for the past 12 years. Deary had always seemed genuinely fond of humans. Sarah had never been sure if that fondness was real or professional, but she'd appreciated it either way. Deary's hand shook slightly as she signed. Nerves, Sarah thought, or something else. Then the senator signed. The room applauded. The holographic banners pulsed with light. Someone had arranged for a fanfare. Actual instruments, played by Concorde musicians, a sound like brass and something lower, resonant, felt more than heard. Gren smiled his loose, easy smile. He walked to the treaty table. He picked up the ceremonial pen. He looked directly at Sarah while he signed. She looked back. She thought, "There it is." He didn't look at the document. He didn't look at the senator or at Ambassador Deary or at any of the cameras. He looked at her, because he knew she knew, and he wanted her to know that it didn't matter. The moment his pen lifted from the paper, everything happened. It didn't happen the way combat happens. Explosive, loud, kinetic. It happened the way a door closes. Quiet, final, the click of a latch catching. Every communication channel went dark at once. The journalists' equipment stopped working. The guards at the exits raised their weapons, not pointed, not threatening, just raised. A dozen Concord officers moved into the room from 3 separate doors that Sarah had not seen open, and above them, through the great curved transparent ceiling of the hall, she saw the Eternal Resolve's outer hull light up as its weapon arrays came online. She heard it then, faint through the hull, the deep vibration of ship engines. Many ship engines, not just the flagship, many ships. The senator stood. "What is—" "Please sit," Gren said. His voice was gentle, patient, the voice of a man who has practiced the next few minutes many times. There is no cause for alarm. There is, however, cause for clarity. He walked to the head of the table. "The treaty you have just signed is binding and real," he said. "I want to be clear about that. We are not breaking the treaty. We are implementing it." He turned to look at the full human delegation, and his 4 eyes moved slowly across the room. Specifically, the provisions on page 47, demilitarization protocols, colonial administration transfer, protected status classification. Sarah had read the treaty. Page 47 was not something the human legal team had flagged. It had been buried, deep, written in the 3rd dialect of Concord administrative language, the one that translated most poorly to human linguistic frameworks. The human team had translated it as cooperative security arrangements. That was not what it said. What it said was, "Upon signing, all human military installations will be subject to immediate Concord inspection and administrative oversight, pending classification review." Classification review was the part that mattered. It meant the Concord decided what class of species humanity was, and if they decided humanity was a Class 4 protected species, non-sovereign, non-combatant, ward state, then every ship, every weapon, every colony fell under Concord jurisdiction, automatically, legally, the moment the ink was dry. They'd had 40 years to hide this language. They'd done it well. At this moment, Gren continued, Concord fleet elements are arriving at each of humanity's 18 colonial systems. They are not there to threaten. They are there to assist with the transition. I want you to understand that we mean your people no harm. Protected status is a genuine protection. You will be safe. The senator's face had gone the color of old paper. You can't. This is a violation of what? Gren asked. Not unkindly. You signed the treaty. We have signed the treaty. The treaty is now law. Sarah counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. She looked at the ceiling, the weapon arrays glowing blue-white outside. She looked at the guards. She looked at the doors. She looked at Gren, who was looking back at her with that specific quality of attention that meant, I know you're the dangerous one. Your fleet, Gren said to her directly, has been asked to stand down. We have communicated this request to your captains. I am told most have already complied. Most, she thought, not all. Commander Voss, Gren said, you will remain aboard this ship for the duration of the transition. He paused, considering the word guest, a gesture of good faith between our people. Hostage, she thought. Of course, she said. Her voice was flat and even. She watched something flicker in Gren's expression. Not surprise, but acknowledgement. He'd expected protest. He'd prepared for it. The evenness threw him slightly, the way a person stepping down a staircase in the dark is thrown by a step that isn't there. She gave him nothing. The senator was still talking. His voice had gotten loud and sharp, the way voices get when a person is saying important words into a room that has already stopped listening. Aides were on their feet. The journalists were attempting to reach their dead equipment. with the specific desperation of people who know the most important story of their careers is happening, and they have no way to record it. Ambassador Deary sat completely still, her small hands folded on the table, looking at no one. Sarah looked at Deary. Deary, very slightly, looked back. Something in the small alien's eyes that Sarah catalogued and did not understand yet. Not guilt, not satisfaction, something older than either. Two Concord officers reached Sarah's position. They were polite. They did not touch her. They gestured toward the far door. She went. The walk through the Eternal Resolve's corridors was long, and the ship was very large, and she used the time. She counted turns. She counted doors. She noted the material of the walls, a composite she recognized from Concord construction specs, lighter than it looked, with a specific resonance frequency that she had once read about in a document that had no business being in the files she was allowed to access. She noted where the guards were, where they weren't. She noted that her escort, despite being professional and alert, was not searching her. They should have searched her. The holding cell was not unpleasant. A bed, a viewport, recycled air that smelled slightly of something mineral and dry. The Concord officer who locked the door did so with the careful courtesy of someone who has been instructed to be humane. Sarah sat on the bed. She looked out the viewport. She could see the bed. Eternal Resolve's outer hull, and beyond it, stars, and between her and the stars, the shapes of ships, human ships, big and small, running lights still on but weapons arrays dark, powered down, standing down, one by one, like candles being blown out. She watched a frigate go dark, then a destroyer, then a carrier. The Meridian? Harlan's ship. She recognized the silhouette. Harlan was good. Harlan would have fought this as long as he could. She watched the Meridian go dark. She checked her watch. The watch was old, a physical watch, analog, a thing that her mother had given her, and that kept time with a small spring mechanism that had nothing to do with any signal or network or frequency that anyone could jam. She looked at the time. She thought one word. Early. She lay back on the bed, and she stared at the ceiling of the cell, and she breathed slowly, and she thought about the transit time from the Oort cloud to the inner system, and she thought about gas giant orbits, and she thought about a man in a bunker under the Sahara who drank terrible coffee and had been waiting, with enormous patience, for exactly this moment. She thought about the 40 years of smiling, the 40 years of diplomatic language and cooperative frameworks and protected status provisions buried in dialect. She thought, they hid their trap in the paperwork. She thought, so did we. Outside the viewport, another human ship went dark. She closed her eyes. She was not worried. She was, in the specific way of people who have been prepared for the worst for a very long time, almost relieved. The waiting was the hard part. The waiting was always the hard part. It was over now. The waiting was over. The treaty was signed. Everything that came next had been ready for 38 years, and Gren had just pulled the pin on it himself, and he had no idea, and that was the only thing in this cell that made Sarah Voss, for one unguarded moment, smile. Not the gold buttons kind of smile, the other kind. She tucked it away, went back to breathing. The stars moved slowly past the viewport as the Eternal Resolve turned on its axis, triumphant and enormous and entirely, catastrophically wrong about what it had just won. Somewhere in the Oort cloud, 38 years of preparation said nothing and waited for the signal. The signal would come. Sarah had checked the time. It was already coming. The coffee was bad. It had always been bad. 38 years of bad coffee in the same mug, with the same hairline crack running from handle to rim, and director Emmanuel Okafor had stopped noticing the crack about 35 years ago, and the bad coffee about 32 years ago. The bunker was 300 meters below the Sahara, and the recycled air tasted like stone and old ambition, and the coffee tasted like something that had been introduced to coffee beans briefly and without warmth. He drank it. He sat. He waited. The screen in front of him showed a simple thing. A clock. Not his watch. A system clock, synced to 6 separate independent sources, because redundancy was the only religion he actually practiced. The clock counted down in hours and minutes and seconds, and he watched it the way a farmer watches weather, not with urgency, but with the calm attention of someone who has already done everything they can do and is now simply waiting for the world to confirm it. The screen to his left showed news feeds from the ceremony aboard the Eternal Resolve. He watched the signing. He watched Gren smile. He watched the feeds go dead. He drank his coffee. Sir. The voice belonged to Dr. Amara Finch, who was 31 years old and had been born in this bunker. Not literally, but near enough. Her mother had worked here, and she'd grown up on stories about it, and when she was old enough she'd come to work here herself, with the specific certainty of someone following a path they'd always known was theirs. She was the best systems engineer he'd ever seen, and she was deeply impatient, and she was standing at the edge of his peripheral vision, doing the things she did when she had information, and was waiting for permission to deliver it. The colonial communication blackout is confirmed. All 18 systems. On schedule? 4 minutes early. Gren was eager, Okafor said. Or nervous. Same thing. He set down his mug. He stood. He was 68 years old, and his knees had opinions about standing that he'd stopped arguing with. Around the same time he'd stopped arguing with the coffee. He walked to the main operations board, a long curved surface with screens covering every inch, each one showing a different piece of a plan that had no name because it had always felt like bad luck to name it. The board showed him the 18 colonial systems. Each one was now surrounded by Concord fleet elements. He could see the signatures, tracked through sensor relays that the Concord didn't know existed because they were woven into the deep space debris fields that no species with a tidy, logical civilization would ever think to look inside. Humanity had spent 22 years hiding sensor arrays inside rocks. Nobody rational does that. The Concord was very rational. He studied the Concord fleet positions. He compared them to projections he'd made 14 years ago. They were close. Not perfect. Gren had put slightly more firepower at Kepler Station than the models predicted, and slightly less at the Mars relay, which was interesting, and probably said something about what Gren thought was valuable, but close. Evacuation confirmation, he said. Finch pulled it up. All 18 colonial populations. Final transport cleared the last system. She checked. 6 hours ago. We're at full confirmation. Okafor nodded. The evacuations had taken 6 months. 6 months of very careful, very quiet moving of 2.3 million people from 18 colonial systems, most of them to stations and settlements deeper in human territory, some of them to temporary habitats that nobody was supposed to know existed. He'd done it using commercial shipping routes, maintenance convoys, medical transfers, tourism charters, anything that looked normal, because anything that looked normal went unexamined by a species that had already decided it knew what humanity was. The Concord thought they had hostages. They had empty buildings. Fleet status, he said. All 8 battle groups confirm ready positions. Any detection events? None. Okafor breathed. The cloaking technology was the thing he was most proud of, not because it was elegant. It wasn't. It was messy and power-hungry, and it had taken 9 years and 4 failed prototypes before they'd gotten it stable, but because of where it came from. The Concord had invented cloaking drives 200 years ago and abandoned them as impractical. The power requirements were too high. The field stability was unreliable. No sensible civilization would deploy them operationally. Humanity had looked at the abandoned research and thought, what if we just accepted the instability? What if the ships used the field fluctuation as part of their movement pattern instead of fighting it? What if you designed the crew schedule around the power spikes instead of trying to eliminate them? It was an ugly solution. It required the crew to work in 4-hour blocks because of the field interference with longer sleep cycles. It required 3 times the maintenance of a standard drive. It made every ship smell faintly of ozone all the time, and gave people headaches behind their left eye specifically, which Dr. UN and Medical had noted in 600 separate patient files before anyone connected it to the drive. But it worked. 8 battle groups, 212 ships, sitting in the gravity shadows of gas giants and behind moons and tucked into the debris fields of asteroid belts, perfectly invisible, all through the ceremony, all through the treaty signing, all through the moment Gren smiled and showed his teeth. He'd been smiling at ghosts. Okafor looked at his countdown clock. 31 minutes. Show me Sarah's signal. Finch brought it up. A small constant pulse, coming from the book. Eternal resolve. Sarah's watch. The analog mechanism put out a tiny, entirely incidental electromagnetic pulse with every tick, the way all analog watches did. No intelligence agency in the galaxy would look for it, because no intelligence agency would believe that anyone was using a watch tick as a carrier signal. But the pulse was there, and it was regular, and the regularity was the signal, and the regularity said, "I am alive, and I am in position, and I am waiting." "Good," Okafor said. He went back to his coffee. There was another thing, and it was the thing he didn't like to think about during the easy parts of the plan, the parts where he was sitting in a bunker waiting. He thought about it now, because now was when it mattered, and he was the kind of man who looked directly at the things he didn't like. 38 years ago, he'd been 28 years old, and he'd been standing in a room in Geneva with 14 other people, all of them the best minds in human government, and they'd watched the first Concorde diplomatic transmission, and they'd listened to the translation, and they'd understood, within an hour of that transmission, what the Concorde was. Not evil, not malicious, something more practical than either. The Concorde was a civilization that had decided, with calm mathematical certainty, that the galaxy had a carrying capacity, and that the species which were already managing it were doing fine, and that new arrivals were, at best, supervised additions. They didn't hate humanity, they didn't fear humanity, they had assessed humanity, 40 years ago, before humanity had faster-than-light travel, before humanity had left its own solar system, and found humanity to be roughly equivalent in threat potential to an interesting geological feature. Notable, worth observing, not significant. They'd had 40 years to update that assessment. They hadn't. That was the thing Okafor thought about, not the fleet, not the weapons, not the cloaking drives or the empty colonies, or the buried treaty language. He thought about the fact that 14 of humanity's best minds, in a room in Geneva, watching that first transmission, had understood within an hour that humanity needed to prepare, and the Concorde, with 800 years of civilization, with 14 species, with the combined intelligence of more minds than humanity had ever had looked at humanity for 40 years and not updated their model. He didn't think they were stupid, he thought they were stable. A stable civilization finds the model that works and runs it. A stable civilization stops asking new questions, because the old questions have good answers. A stable civilization looks at a new thing and sorts it into a known category and proceeds. They had sorted humanity into manageable, and proceeded. This was their flaw, this specific thing, and it was not a flaw he took pleasure in, because the same flaw existed in humans. He'd fought it for 38 years inside his own organization, people who looked at the Concorde and said, "We can negotiate, we can trust the process, we don't need to prepare for the worst." The impulse toward stability, the impulse to not update the model. He'd won those arguments. He'd taken no pleasure in that either. The countdown hit 12 minutes. Finch was at his elbow. The decoy fleet is beginning to show power-down signatures. Which ships? The ones Gren can see. Good. The decoy fleet was the other ugly solution. 200 human ships, older vessels, civilian conversions, some military hulls that were past their operational date, all running minimum crews, all positioned where a sensible enemy would expect the human fleet to be. They'd been powering down in careful sequence since the treaty signing began, visible to Concorde sensors, performing exactly the compliance that Gren had demanded. From Gren's perspective, the human fleet was standing down, the colonies were occupied, the hostages were in place, the trap was closed. He picked up the transmission module. He keyed the frequency, Concorde diplomatic channel, the one that went directly to the flagship's command bridge. He sat for a moment, looking at the dead coffee in his mug. Then he sent one transmission, 4 words. "We know. Good luck." He set down the module. Finch stared at him. 4 words, she said. "He'll spend 6 minutes trying to decide if it means what it means," Okafor said. 6 minutes where he's looking at my transmission instead of his sensors. Finch thought about this. "That's horrible," she said. "Yes," he agreed. The countdown hit 7 minutes. On the operations board, the 18 colonial systems sat quiet and occupied and empty. 2.3 million human beings were safe, scattered, waiting in temporary habitats and deep space stations, in the dark, eating whatever the emergency rations tasted like, listening to ship sounds and trying to sleep, and trusting that the plan would work. He owed them the plan working. He drank the last of his coffee. The countdown hit 3 minutes. All fleet elements confirm combat ready, Finch said. Weapon systems? Online and locked. Resonance arrays? Calibrated. We confirmed the hull frequency data against the sensor recordings from the ceremony. Okafor nodded. The resonance disruptor had been his youngest engineer's idea, a kid named Park who had grown up in the third generation of colonists on Kepler Station, and who had, at age 23, looked at the Concorde hull composition data that the diplomatic teams had been quietly collecting for decades and said, calmly, "Their ships sing. If you play the right note, they stop being able to function." He hadn't meant it literally. The physics was complex, but the principle held. Every material had a resonant frequency, and the Concorde used a very specific composite for their ship hulls because it was cheap and strong, and they'd been using it for 160 years because it worked, and they had no reason to change it. A sufficiently powerful resonance field at that frequency would create structural interference that would cascade through the ship's internal systems, not destroying anything, not killing anyone, but making the ship's electronic systems incoherent. Every sensor, every navigation array, every weapons targeting system. The ship would drift, the crew would be fine. The ship would simply not be able to do anything. Park had tested it on a decommissioned Concorde trading vessel they'd acquired through channels that Okafor had never asked about. It had worked perfectly. The crew of 3 had floated in a perfectly functional life support bubble inside a completely useless ship for 6 hours before they'd been quietly returned to Concorde space, with a very confusing medical incident on their records. The countdown hit 30 seconds. Okafor stood at the board. He felt, as he always felt at moments like this, the specific weight of consequence. Not regret, not second-guessing, just the awareness of the size of what was happening and the permanent nature of the next few minutes. Once you start a thing like this, you have started it. There is no unsigning the countermove. He thought about the 2.3 million people in the dark. He thought about Sarah in that cell, checking her watch. 10 seconds. He thought about a room in Geneva, 38 years ago, and 14 people who'd made a choice. 5. He thought. We told you we weren't manageable. 0. All fleet elements, Finch said, and her voice was very steady, are now visible. On the board, across 18 systems, and in the Sol system itself, 212 ships dropped their cloaking fields simultaneously. The Concorde, in all 18 occupied systems, had approximately 90 seconds before the first engagement. It would not be enough time. Okafor looked at his mug. He was going to need more coffee. The door opened. Sarah was already standing. The Concorde officer who stepped through had a weapon in his hand, and orders that he had clearly been given recently enough that they were still a little surprising to him. His 4 eyes swept the cell, the bed, the viewport, the empty wall, and found Sarah in the center of the room, hands at her sides, weight forward. He said something in Vithali that she did not speak. She spoke in Standard Concorde, which she'd been studying for 14 years. "I know what you're here to do," she said. "And I know you're alone because Gren got a transmission he didn't expect, and he's dealing with that, and he gave you your orders, and now you're here, and you're alone." The officer said nothing. "There are 42 guards aboard this ship," she said. 17 of them are Vithali. 9 are mean. The rest are mixed species. The mean don't want this war. You've already heard about the transmission, or you will in about 90 seconds. And when you do, what you're going to want is to be able to tell someone in authority that you were following orders from an admiral who just lost the moral consent of 3 member species. He was listening. She could see it in his posture. Not agreement. She wasn't asking for agreement. Or, she said, you could shoot me and be the person who killed the hostage when the war was already lost. Silence. The weapon didn't lower, but it didn't rise. "The cell is already unlocked," she said. "Someone on this ship unlocked it 11 minutes ago. I don't know who, but someone did." He looked at the door. Then he looked at her. Then he stepped aside. Sarah walked out. The corridors of the eternal resolve were not in chaos yet, but they were moving toward it. She could feel the pressure of information traveling through the ship, The way pressure travels through water, that invisible alteration in the density of the air that happens when a large number of people are receiving news they do not know how to process. Officers walked faster. Conversations cut short. The specific silence of a command crew that has just had a certainty removed. She moved fast. She moved like she belonged here, which was the only strategy available to her. She knew where the bridge was. She'd memorized the ship's layout 6 months ago from a combination of Concorde construction records, sensor sweep data from the diplomatic approach, and a very detailed account from a Concorde trading captain who'd served aboard a sister vessel and had, over a long and expensive dinner on Mars Station, been willing to talk about his old posting. He'd had no idea why she was interested. People in love with their own careers rarely do. 3 turns, down a long corridor, left at the junction by the secondary power relay. A guard, mean, small, wearing the expression of a person who had just heard something that changed the shape of their day. She looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at her. Sarah said, in her best Concorde standard, "Gren's orders. The commander needs to come with me." The guard let her pass. The bridge doors were Concorde standard, heavy, 2-layer, designed to be sealed in emergency. They were not sealed. Someone had not sealed them, and Sarah was going to owe that someone something she would probably never be able to repay. She went through. The bridge of the Mon, Eternal Resolve, was circular and enormous and deeply occupied. 30 crew members, half of them at stations, half of them on their feet, all of them looking at displays that were showing them something they had not been briefed to expect. The main screen showed a tactical display, Sol system, and on the tactical display, where there had been a compliant, powering down human fleet 20 minutes ago, there were now 212 new contacts. Many of them were much larger than the Concorde models had projected. The bridge crew noticed Sarah approximately 2 seconds after she noticed them. Admiral Gren was at the center of the room. He looked at her. "How?" he said. Not a question. A calculation running in real time. "You should have searched me," she said. She had an emergency transmission device the size of a thumbnail taped to the inside of her left wrist. She had a signal disruptor in the heel of her boot. She had a contact charge on 3 fingers of her right hand that would disable any standard Concorde electronic lock within 10 seconds of skin contact. These were not weapons. She had brought no weapons to the treaty ceremony. She'd brought tools, which were a different category of concern entirely. And the difference was the 38-year gap between what the Concorde thought humanity was and what humanity actually was. She walked toward the broadcast console. 2 crew members moved to intercept. She used the contact charges on the console housing as she passed it, and the security lockout on the broadcast system stuttered and died, and she was broadcasting on all Concorde standard frequencies before anyone reached her. "My name is Commander Sarah Voss of the Earth Defense Command," she said, clearly, in standard Concorde. "What you are about to hear is the private communication record from this ship's bridge, captured over the past 14 hours, including all conversations that took place before and during the treaty signing ceremony." She hit the playback. Gren's voice filled the bridge. His actual voice, not the voice he'd used in the ceremony, the patient diplomatic one, but the voice from his private briefings, the one he used with his officers. She'd had a passive acoustic recorder in the lining of her uniform jacket, a device that technically did not exist in any form the Concorde had ever banned, because they'd never thought anyone would build it, because it was an incredibly stupid thing to build, requiring no active components and no power source beyond vibration, recording nothing but raw air movement that could be reconstructed into intelligible sound by a system on the other end, which was what Finch was running right now in the bunker under the Sahara, cleaning the signal and pushing it out to every receiver in range. The device was, objectively, a passive acoustic recorder, made of repurposed materials that could be found in any supply closet. It was also completely undetectable by any scan the Concorde used. Nobody builds a passive acoustic recorder. It was a technology from before electronic recording existed. There was no reason to have one in the modern era, unless you were going to walk into a room that would scan you for every modern device. Gren's recorded voice said, clearly, in his own tongue. "The human species cannot be allowed to develop further. The treaty gives us legal authority. Once the colonies are secured, we reclassify. In 3 generations, they're a managed population. In 5, they're domesticated. It's the only humane outcome. The bridge was silent. Not the combat-ready silence from before. This was something different. This was the silence of people hearing a thing said plainly, that they had believed only in comfortable abstraction. The silence of moral accounting arriving without warning. 3 of the bridge crew, mean species, sat down. One of them began speaking into her personal communicator. Gen crossed the bridge in 7 steps. Sarah was ready for 6. He got to her with one hand out, and she caught the wrist and turned, and he went down, and she stepped away, and said, to the room, "Your fleet is currently engaged across 18 systems. You can confirm this on your tactical display." She gestured at the main screen. "The human populations you believed you were holding as leverage have been evacuated. Every colony has been empty for 6 months. You have been occupying buildings." She let that land. "The resonance arrays are already operating in 8 of your 18 system fleet deployments. Your ships there cannot maneuver. Their crews are unharmed. They are simply stopped." On the main tactical display, confirmation was coming in. A Concord system flag at Kepler, going from active to communication loss. Then another. Then another. Each one lit red, then went dark. "The treaty you wrote," Sarah said, "has a clause on page 47. We wrote one too. It's on page 12. Your diplomatic team translated it as mutual review rights. It says, in the event of military aggression by either party following the treaty signing, all terms become null, and human forces are released from all demilitarization obligations." She looked at Gren, who was on the floor, looking up at her with his 4 eyes, and an expression she had no Concord vocabulary for. "We signed your treaty," she said. "You just signed ours." Outside the viewport, the battle for Sol was beginning. The Concord forces that had entered the Sol system expecting to find a compliant, disarmed, diminished humanity found the opposite in the specific and disorienting way of something that cannot be processed quickly enough to respond to. The human ships came from every direction, not from a battle line, not from a formation, but from individual positions that made no tactical sense, until suddenly they did, because the human ships were not fighting the way the Concord models predicted, because the human ships were not following any doctrine that the Concord had on file. The Concord had 800 years of battle records. They had modeled and wargamed, and predicted the military behavior of every species they had ever encountered. They had exceptional models. The models assumed the enemy would try to win. Human tacticians had spent 20 years reading Concord doctrine, and had reached a specific conclusion. Don't try to win. Make the enemy incapable of processing what's happening. Hit from the unexpected angle, at the unexpected time, with the unexpected weapon, and when the enemy adjusts, don't fight the adjustment. Be somewhere else entirely. Don't have a pattern. Patterns are for opponents who have time to find them. The Concord fleet in Seoul was very large and very well trained, and entirely unable to get a targeting solution that stayed valid for more than 4 seconds. Gren stood up. His composure was remarkable. She gave him that. Whatever he was feeling was behind something very solid and very old in his face, and what he showed her was command posture, not fear. "Your weapons," he began. "Will not destroy your ships," she said. "We're not here to kill your crews. We're here to make it impossible for you to do this again." He looked at the tactical display. "You planned all of this," he said. 40 years. 38. The first 2 we were still deciding." Something moved in his expression. The closest word she had for it was respect. But not the warm kind. The kind that comes from recognizing a quality in an opponent that you didn't know was there. "What do you want?" he said. "Right now, I want you to call off the 4 systems that haven't gone dark yet. Save your crews the experience." He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at his tactical display. He picked up the command channel. He issued the stand-down order. Sarah watched 3 more system flags stop flickering and go to ceasefire confirm. One didn't. She looked at Gren. "That's Veth Prime system," he said, and there was something complicated in his voice. "I don't command the forces there," she thought. "Of course there's a faction that doesn't stop," she thought. "There's always a faction," she thought. "That's going to be a problem for later." She looked back at the tactical display, at the shape of what was happening across 18 systems and 1 home system, At 200 years of Concord certainty, meeting 38 years of human preparation, and she thought that the thing nobody would write about afterward, the thing that never made it into official records, was that none of this had been inevitable. Any one of 100 moments in the past 40 years could have gone differently. Gren could have taken humans seriously in the beginning. The Concord could have offered real terms instead of a trap. Humanity could have trusted the process and disarmed and accepted protected status, and lived small and managed and safe. But those were all versions of a history that hadn't happened. She turned to the bridge crew. "I need communications access and a chair," she said. "We have a lot of systems to coordinate." Nobody argued. She sat down at a Concord console and began doing the work. Outside the great viewport, the Sol system was full of ships, and the ships were full of people, and the people were doing what people do: fighting, stopping, surrendering, holding, breaking, deciding. And at the center of all of it, Sarah Voss pulled up a communications channel and thought about what to say, and said it, and kept going. She had built a key. Now she was using it. 3 species left within 6 hours. Not retreated. Left. Formally. With transmissions to their own populations, and a jointly addressed message to the Concord High Command that used the diplomatic language of withdrawal, which was the most damning language available in Concord formal communication, because it meant, "We are no longer responsible for what happens next." The Mean withdrew first. Ambassador Deary issued the statement personally, in a broadcast that reached 40 systems before anyone thought to restrict it. The Mean had been uncomfortable for years, the statement said. The Mean had raised concerns through proper channels. The Mean had been assured those concerns were administrative rather than moral in nature. The statement was 7 paragraphs. Every paragraph was a polite and devastating indictment. The Thar and the Kolesi withdrew within the hour, citing the broadcast from the Eternal Resolves bridge, citing Gren's private words about domestication, citing the revelation that civilian populations had already been evacuated, which meant, the Thar ambassador noted with dry precision, that the Concord had been occupying empty buildings while claiming to protect innocent lives. "They knew," Finch said. Okafor looked up from his board. "Who?" "The 3 that withdrew. They already knew." She pulled up the Mean communication logs, the ones that the Human Intelligence Network had been passively collecting for a decade. Look at the timestamp on Deary's statement. She'd written it before the broadcast from the flagship. She was waiting. Okafor thought about Deary's eyes at the treaty table, the something older than guilt he couldn't quite name. "She was waiting for us to move first," he said. "She couldn't pull out before the trap sprang. That would have warned Gren. She needed Gren to spring it. So she was doing what we were doing," he said. "She was waiting for the right moment." He filed that away. It was information he would need later. 4 Concord species remained committed: the Vethali, Gren's people, the Keth, the Orin, and the Sul. These 4 had the deepest institutional investment in the Concord structure, which meant the deepest investment in humanity's subjugation, because the structure and the subjugation were connected in ways that a withdrawal would unravel. If humanity became a full equal, certain economic arrangements stopped working. Certain access agreements required renegotiation. The 4 species that remained were not ideologically committed to humanity's oppression. They were financially committed to it, which was, in Okafor's experience, harder to argue with and easier to outlast. He watched the tactical board as the 4 loyal species moved. The move was predictable. He'd modeled it 6 times. When threatened, the Concord's doctrine called for decisive force against the thing causing the threat. Not tactical engagement, not strategic maneuvering, but the application of overwhelming power to end the thing creating the problem. It was a doctrine that had worked for 800 years, which was exactly why they still used it. They aimed for the colonies. All 18 colonial systems, simultaneously, target, colonial infrastructure. The intent was clear, and Okafor had been clear with himself for a long time about what that intent meant. If the colonies were destroyed, humanity lost its extraplanetary population base, its industrial capacity beyond Earth, its ability to resist Concord authority without also destroying itself. With the colonies gone, humanity would have to choose between resistance and survival. The Concord expected to make that choice agonizing. The autonomous defense grids made it irrelevant. Okafor had been building them for 11 years. Not building, seeding. The difference was important. Building implied something large and visible, something a Concorde sensor sweep would find. Seeding meant small units, dispersed, hidden in the same debris fields where he hid his sensor arrays, networked to each other with systems that activated only when triggered, and triggered only by specific attack signatures. The grids were cheap. They were unsophisticated. Each individual unit was, genuinely, not falsely, too small and too simple to show up on a Concorde tactical scan. It was a single relay node about the size of a human fist, with one purpose. When it detected an attack profile, it connected to its neighbors, and collectively, the network became something that was neither cheap nor unsophisticated. The Concorde fired on Kepler Station. What met their weapons was approximately 40,000 relay nodes coming online in sequence, creating a defense network that blanketed the entire approach corridor, that had no central command node to destroy, that could not be jammed because its communication method was physical. Vibration through the debris field itself, a principle from seismology that Park had also been responsible for, because Park was either a genius or a disaster, and Okafor had long since decided the two were the same thing. The attack on Kepler failed. So did the attack on New Carthage, and on Europa Station, and on every other colonial target, in the same way, for the same reason. You cannot destroy a swarm by hitting its center, because a swarm does not have a center. The four loyal species adjusted. Okafor watched them adjust. They were competent. He was not dismissive of them. They pulled back from the colonies and reoriented toward the human fleet itself, which was a smarter target, and would have been devastating if the human fleet had been where the Concorde sensors said it was. The human fleet was not where the Concorde sensors said it was. This was not cloaking. The cloaking drives were power-hungry and needed rest cycles. This was older than cloaking. This was the simple, available, technically unsophisticated method of being somewhere your enemy doesn't think to look. The human tactical doctrine called it ambiguity positioning. What it meant in practice was, human ship captains were specifically selected and trained for their ability to be in the wrong place at the right time. They didn't hold formation, they didn't cluster, they moved constantly, individually, in patterns that were not patterns but that covered space in a way that meant the Concorde targeting systems were always, on average, 40 seconds out of date. 40 seconds is not much time. In space combat, 40 seconds is forever. Gren is being confined to quarters, Finch reported. Okafor looked up. By whom? His own crew. A faction. She pulled the communication intercept. Two of his senior officers issued a joint command authority declaration about 20 minutes ago. They're citing the broadcast, citing the mean withdrawal, citing the tactical situation. They're ending his command. They're trying to end the war, Finch said. They're requesting communication with Sarah directly. Okafor considered this. The faction in Gren's crew that wanted to stop was not driven by conscience, or not primarily. It was driven by the same force that drives most decisions at moments like this. The difference between a war you think you can win and one you know you can't. These officers looked at their tactical display and saw something that Gren, to his credit or his detriment, had refused to see. The shape of what was happening was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Humanity was not fighting to destroy the Concorde fleet. Humanity was fighting to prove it could. That was worse, from a Concorde perspective. Much worse. Because fleets can be rebuilt. The knowledge that you've been fundamentally miscalculated about what an opponent is, that doesn't rebuild. That sits in the record. Let Sarah handle the communication, he said. She's on the flagship. He turned back to the board. The remaining concern was Veth Prime. Veth Prime, the Vethali home system, had a fleet element that had not received or had not accepted Gren's stand-down order. Veth Prime's forces were under a different command authority, a sub-admiral named Devar who was, according to the intelligence profiles, exactly what the name suggested, a devoted, incurious, loyal officer who had received his orders before the war started and had not received any credible update since. Devar was currently moving toward Seoul. His force was not large enough to win the battle there. He had to know that, but large enough to make it more costly, and Devar was, Okafor suspected, the kind of person who believed that cost imposition was its own form of loyalty. Sole defense status, he said. Fleet elements at full tactical readiness. The moon platform is active and targeted. The moon platform. He'd had several names for it over the years. The platform, mostly, or the project, or occasionally, at 3 in the morning over bad coffee when he was feeling dramatic. Our answer. The moon, eternal resolve, had been built to impress, to make humans feel small when they walked into its hall with its 300 feet of polished floor and its false sky ceiling. The moon, Earth's moon, the one human beings had been looking at for 1,000,000 years, had been chosen specifically because no one would think it had changed. The surface hadn't. The surface was the same dust and rock and silence it had always been. The interior was something else. 22 years of work, the deepest, most protected secret of the entire program. A weapons platform that used the moon's own mass as armor, that drew power from a reactor buried 4 kilometers below the surface, that could target anything within the Sol system and most things within the inner systems of the nearest stellar neighbors, that had been built by human beings who had decided, at a meeting in Geneva 38 years ago, that if the galaxy was going to treat humanity as a manageable species, then humanity was going to make that a very expensive mistake. Davar's forces entered Sol. Okafor opened a direct channel to the platform. He said one thing, targeting only, no fire yet. The platform's targeting arrays came online. Davar's fleet, already confused by the disorganized seeming human ships everywhere, suddenly found every single one of their tactical systems returning the same reading, full lock, from everywhere, from nowhere visible, from something that didn't register as a ship on any of their scans, from the moon. The fleet stopped moving. Davar held for 11 minutes. Okafor timed it. 11 minutes of a very senior military officer looking at targeting locks from an impossible source and running calculations about what the impossible source implied. Then Davar requested communication. Okafor opened the channel. Sub-Admiral. What is that? Not a question. Not quite. That's the moon, Okafor said. A long silence. You've been building inside. For 22 years. Another silence. Longer. Okafor let it sit. My orders are to engage, Davar said. I know. I'm offering you an alternative. And if I decline the alternative? Okafor looked at his board. At the targeting locks. At the 2.3 million people in temporary habitats who were waiting to go home. At 38 years of bad coffee and careful preparation. And the specific weight of consequence that he'd felt at the countdown, and felt now heavier. Because this was the moment where it was real, and not theoretical. Then you decline it, he said, and we find out what happens next. Davar's fleet held its position. Then, slowly, it began to power down. Not all at once. First one ship, then another, a cascade of decisions made by individual captains who looked at their targeting data and made the same calculation Davar had made, the calculation that Okafor had believed most intelligent beings would eventually make when presented with sufficient information. The calculation. We cannot win this, and the thing they built instead of coming for us. If they wanted to destroy us, they would have done it before we knew they existed. An hour later, the last Concorde warship in Sol was dark. Okafor sat down. He felt, for the first time in 38 years, the specific absence of the weight he'd been carrying. Not relief. Relief was too small for it. Something larger. Something that sat in the chest and made breathing feel different. Like air had a different quality, when you weren't using it to hold yourself together. Finch put a mug of coffee on the console beside him. He looked at it. It smelled exactly the same as always. Bad. Familiar. Like stone and old ambition and 3 a.m., and the hairline crack in the mug that had been there so long he'd stopped seeing it. He drank it. Outside, in the dark, in 18 systems and 1 home system, the war was ending. In temporary habitats and deep space stations, 2.3 million people were being told they could go home. In a holding room somewhere on the eternal resolve. A Vithali admiral was sitting with the truth of what he'd underestimated, and it was just beginning to reach him. Okafor drank his coffee. He started writing the communication to begin negotiations. He used very simple words. He'd been composing it for a long time, and he'd learned that simple was harder to misunderstand, and he was very, very tired of being misunderstood. The negotiations took 11 weeks. They took 11 weeks because the thing nobody tells you about winning a war is that winning a war is the easy part. The war has clear objectives. The war has defined enemies and measurable progress. The war ends and then you are left with the aftermath, which is 12 species, and a ruined framework, and 17 different interpretations of what just happened, all of them trying to become the official interpretation before the historians arrive. Sarah sat in the same rooms where treaties had been signed, and she sat with Concord representatives who were no longer sure what the Concord was, and she said what Earth's government had told her to say, which was also what she believed, which made it easier. Humanity wanted equal standing. Humanity wanted acknowledgement that the treaty had been invalid, a weapon dressed as a document. Humanity wanted the right to expand, to develop, to govern its own colonies, to build its own fleet. Humanity wanted, explicitly and in writing, to be left alone. The Concord representatives across the table heard all of this and waited for the rest, for the territory claims, the tribute demands, the punishment clauses, the reparations, the dominance games that every species played when they won something significant. They waited for humanity to show them the shape of the empire it was building. There was no empire. Sarah watched them not understand that for several weeks. The Mean understood it first. Deary was part of the Mean delegation, and Deary had been watching humanity for 20 years, and Deary had a theory that she shared with Sarah one evening, in the margins of a negotiation session, quietly, in the way of someone who has been holding a thought for a long time. "You are not interested in ruling," Deary said. "No," Sarah said. "You are interested in not being ruled." "Yes." Deary was quiet for a moment. "That is very difficult for the others to model," she said. "Every dominant species in our records has used dominance to accumulate further dominance. You are the first we've encountered who appears to genuinely want to stop." "We don't want to stop," Sarah said. "We want to expand. We want to build. We want to go places we haven't gone yet. We just don't want to own the people we meet when we get there. The distinction is significant." "We know. The Keth and the Oran were harder. They'd been the most financially invested in the original Concord structure, and they negotiated with the energy of people defending a business model rather than a philosophy. Sarah respected that, in a specific and limited way. At least the stakes were clear. 3 of her sharpest economic minds spent 5 weeks in adjacent rooms breaking down trade agreements, resource access frameworks, preferred partner arrangements, and by the end they had something that the Keth and Oran didn't love but could survive with, which was the standard definition of a fair deal. The Sul didn't negotiate. The Sul sent a single representative who said very little and took very detailed notes, and withdrew to consult with their government, and sent a counter-proposal that was largely acceptable, with 2 specific exceptions that turned out to be internally political rather than substantive. Those were resolved in 2 days. The Vithali were last. Gren was not at the table. Gren had been remanded to the joint tribunal. The Vithali representatives who came to negotiate were younger than Gren, more pragmatic, carrying the weight of what their admiral had done, and doing the thing that competent people do when they inherit a disaster. They focused entirely on the practical question of what happens now. What happens now turned out to be, primarily, a security framework. The Vithali had been the military backbone of the Concord for 200 years. Their concern was not economic. Their concern was, what does the galaxy look like when there are 2 major military powers rather than 1? What are the rules? Sarah spent 3 weeks on this. She brought in people from Earth's defense establishment, and from the 3 defecting species, and from academic institutions that studied conflict history, human and alien, and they built something that she would not have been able to predict in advance, a joint security charter that was not a treaty of peers in the traditional sense, but something more like a conversation, with scheduled review points and explicit mechanisms for objection and an acknowledgement, written into the document's preamble, that the charter was a beginning rather than a conclusion. The Vithali representative read the preamble twice. He looked up. "You have written uncertainty into the foundation," he said. "Yes," Sarah said. "That is highly irregular. We noticed that regular things had certain problems." He read it a 3rd time. He signed. The tribunal took another 4 weeks after the negotiations. Gren was tried, not by humans, Sarah had made this point clearly and consistently, by a joint body that included Mean and Thar and Kolesi judges alongside Vithali legal representatives and 2 human legal observers. Humanity provided testimony, provided the bridge recordings, provided the communication intercepts and the treaty language analysis, and the full documentation of the trap's construction over 40 years. Then humanity stepped back and let the process work. The verdict was not Sarah's business, and she treated it as not her business, which was harder than it sounded. She had been in the cell. She had walked through those corridors. She had looked at Gren across his own bridge and watched him try to understand what had gone wrong and failed. She'd read the tribunal proceedings every night in her quarters. She'd kept that to herself. Gren was convicted of 17 counts under Concord law, mostly conspiracy, unlawful occupation, violations of the diplomatic framework. He was sentenced to 20 years in a Concord facility, reduced from the initial recommendation because 3 of the species that had been used as instruments of the trap argued that Gren had believed he was acting within legitimate authority, which was a mitigating factor, and which Sarah believed was probably accurate, because the most dangerous kind of wrong is the kind that doesn't know it's wrong. She sent no message to the tribunal about the sentence. She had opinions, she kept them. Okafor retired on the day the negotiations formally concluded. There was no ceremony, no official announcement. He simply stopped coming to the bunker. He went back to Lagos, to a house that had been tended by his sister for 38 years, with a garden that she'd maintained through those years with the specific stubbornness of someone who believes the person the garden is for will return. He planted tomatoes. He did not answer requests for interviews. There were many requests. He did not answer any of them. There would be a history written eventually, and the history would name him, and he had decided, with the same careful deliberation he'd applied to every other significant choice of his life, that he would not participate in it. He had said what needed to be said during the years when it mattered. The years when it no longer mattered were his own. The tomatoes grew well. The soil in Lagos was good. He was, for the first time in 38 years, not thinking about anything in particular. He found he liked it. Park, the engineer who'd invented the resonance disruptor and the acoustic recorder and the seismographic communication network, and who was, collectively, responsible for more of the outcome than anyone who hadn't been in that bunker would ever know, was given an official commendation and offered 17 different prestigious positions, and turned all of them down in favor of returning to Kepler Station, which had been his home, to help with the reconstruction. He was 26 years old. He would do 17 more significant things before he was 40. Sarah was offered command of the new joint fleet, the one being assembled from human forces and the 3 allied species military elements, a patrol and security organization designed to handle the new galactic reality that nobody entirely had language for yet. It was a large command. It was a meaningful command. It came with resources she'd never had, and a mandate that was, legitimately, important. She sat with it for 2 weeks. She didn't think about the command itself. She thought about the young officer who would eventually stand at some window above some station and ask the question that young officers ask when they've inherited something large and confusing and want someone to summarize it for them. She thought about what she wanted to have done before she became the person who answered that question. She thought about the 18 colonial systems, the people who'd come home to buildings that were largely intact because the Concord had expected to administer them, not destroy them, and who were rebuilding in the specific chaotic way of human communities that have been through something serious and have come out the other side, and have decided the other side is where they live now. She accepted the command. She did it without ceremony, sent a one-word message to the appointment office. Yes. Then she went to work. The first thing she did was invite Deary to a meeting about the long-range patrol framework. The second thing she did was formally request access to the Concord star charts for regions that had never had human presence. The third thing she did was start reading everything she could find about the 6 species that existed outside the Concord's previous sphere of influence, the ones nobody had managed yet, the ones that nobody had decided were manageable. She had notes. She had models. She had 38 years of humanity's very particular approach to preparation. She thought about what Deary had said. You are interested in not being ruled. She thought, yes, and also in meeting whatever's out there before it decides what we are. The station above Earth was quiet at this hour. It was late by ship time, the arbitrary ship clock hour that functions as midnight for people who live without natural cycles. The viewport showed Earth below, blue and white and unchanged, which was the only thing about the past 11 months that had felt like a constant. And beyond Earth, the stars, and between the stars, the dark where things were that nobody had gotten to yet. The young officer found her there. She'd been expecting him. He'd been hovering at the edge of her awareness for an hour, wanting to approach, lacking the confidence to do it, finally doing it because ship's late hour creates a kind of permission that formal daylight hours don't. He was new enough that his boots still looked like they'd never been worn in. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm sorry to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me." He stood beside her, looked at Earth. "I was hoping," he started, and stopped, and tried again. "I wanted to ask what it was really about." "The war." She looked at Earth. She thought about the treaty signing, the gold buttons, the smile on Gren's face that was looser than it should have been, the walk through the corridors where she counted turns and noted doors, and thought about resonance frequencies, the cell, and the unlocked door, and the 38 years of preparation that had made the door possible. She thought about a room in Geneva, and 14 people making a choice. She thought about bad coffee and tomatoes in Lagos. "They thought peace was something you give to someone weaker than you," she said. "We showed them what peace actually costs." The young officer waited. He was waiting for more. She let him wait. After a moment, he understood that there wasn't more, and that was itself an answer of some kind, and he nodded, once, the way a person nods when they've received something they'll need time to open, and he stepped back and left her to the viewport. She looked at the stars for a while longer. Then she went to her office and started working on the patrol routes for the next quarter, and the briefing materials for the first Joint Species Training Program, and the formal request for survey ships to head into uncharted space, and the long, careful, necessary letter to Deary about what they both wanted the next 50 years to look like. She worked until ship's dawn. She worked because there was work, and the work mattered, and the window for doing it right was exactly as long as they made it. In a Concord correctional facility, in a standard-issue room with a viewport that showed an uninspiring piece of orbital infrastructure, Admiral Gren received the day's news on his standard-issue datapad. He read about the new Joint Security Charter. He read about the patrol programs. He read about human survey ships heading into the dark beyond the old Concord boundaries. He read about the trade negotiations with the Keth, and the cultural exchange programs with the Mean, and the first joint scientific station with the Thar. He read about a species called the Vora, encountered by a human survey ship 3 weeks ago, in a region the Concord had never mapped. The Vora were described as large, territorial, and deeply uninterested in contact. He read the human survey team's response to the Vora's hostility. They'd sent them a gift, something musical, a recording of something called jazz. The Vora had not attacked. The Vora had sent back a recording of their own. Gren set down the datapad. He looked at the orbital infrastructure in his viewport. He picked the datapad back up. He kept reading, because there was always more, because humanity kept being something that his models had not predicted, and kept being it in directions he hadn't anticipated. And because the thing about being wrong about a thing is that sometimes you cannot stop looking at the evidence of your wrongness, even when it does you no good, even when there is nothing to be done with the looking, except to learn, finally, the shape of what you missed. He read for a long time. He didn't stop until they turned the lights off.